What if the more you chase someone, the further they run, but the moment you stop chasing, they start moving towards you? Most people believe that if someone pulls away, the answer is to text more, explain more, and fight harder for their attention. But psychology tells us something completely different. The people who seem impossible to reach are often not looking for more pressure. They're looking for space. And the moment you understand this, you stop losing your power and start becoming magnetic. Today, you're going to learn the exact mindset shift that can transform your relationship dynamics and make an avoidant person see your value in a completely new way. I want to start with what may be the most important shift you'll ever make in your dating life, your relationships, and your sense of self-worth. Stop chasing. Start choosing. Now, I know that sounds simple, but most people never truly understand what it means. They hear those words and think it's some kind of game. They think it's about pretending not to care. They think it's about waiting longer to text back or acting distant to create mystery. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something much deeper. I'm talking about the moment you stop seeing another person's attention as the prize and start recognizing your own value as something that doesn't need to be earned through endless effort. You see, when someone starts pulling away, most people's instinct is to move closer. They send another message. They ask what's wrong. They try harder. They become more available. They give more of their energy, more of their time, more of their emotional investment. And all of that comes from a place of fear. The fear that if they don't do something right now, they're going to lose the connection. The fear that if they don't say the perfect thing, the other person will disappear. The fear that they are somehow one text message away from fixing everything. But here's what happens. The more you chase someone, the more your focus shifts away from your own value and onto their approval. Suddenly, your mood depends on whether they replied. Your confidence depends on whether they called. Your sense of worth depends on whether they chose you. And that's a dangerous place to be because you've handed someone else the power to determine how you feel about yourself. I want you to think about that for a second. How many times have you spent hours analyzing a message? How many times have you looked at your phone hoping for a response? How many times have you convinced yourself that if you could just find the right words, everything would change? What if the real problem isn't that you haven't found the right words? What if the real problem is that you've forgotten your own worth in the process? Because attraction is not built on convincing someone to see your value. Attraction grows when someone experiences your value. And they can't experience your value when you're constantly trying to prove it. One of the most attractive qualities in the world is someone who knows who they are. Not someone who thinks they're perfect, not someone who never feels insecure, but someone who understands that their value doesn't disappear simply because another person fails to recognize it. When you operate from that place, everything changes. You stop asking, how do I make them choose me? And you start asking, are they showing me the qualities that deserve my investment? Do you see the difference? One question comes from scarcity, the other comes from self-respect. The first question assumes that they are the prize. The second question reminds you that a relationship is not a one-way audition. It's a mutual evaluation. They're evaluating you, and you should be evaluating them too. Are they consistent? Are they kind? Are they emotionally available? Do their actions match their words? Do they make your life better? Or are you so focused on winning them over that you've stopped paying attention to whether they're actually right for you? This is where people lose themselves. They become so obsessed with being chosen that they forget they have a choice. And when you forget that you have a choice, you begin tolerating things you should never tolerate. Mixed signals, half-hearted effort, emotional unavailability, broken promises. You accept less because you're afraid that asking for more will push them away. But here's the truth. The right person isn't looking for someone willing to abandon their standards. The right person is looking for someone who values themselves enough to have standards. When you start choosing instead of chasing, you begin showing up differently. You become calmer. You become more grounded. You stop reacting to every little shift in someone's behavior. You stop feeling like every delayed text is a crisis. You stop trying to force outcomes. And that energy is incredibly powerful because confidence isn't loud. Confidence isn't controlling. Confidence isn't demanding. Confidence is the quiet belief that you'll be okay no matter what happens. It's the belief that your happiness isn't dependent on one person. It's the belief that if someone walks away, your life still moves forward. And ironically, that is often the moment people become more attracted to you. Not because you're playing hard to get, not because you're using psychology tricks, but because you've stopped giving off the energy of someone desperately seeking validation. You've become someone who values themselves, and people are naturally drawn to that. So if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this: stop trying to convince someone to choose you. Start becoming the person who remembers they have a choice too. Because the moment you stop chasing approval is the moment you start walking in your true value. Now, once you've stopped chasing and started choosing, the next shift becomes incredibly important, because this is where most people sabotage themselves without even realizing it. When someone pulls away, people often panic. And panic has a language. It's the language of long emotional paragraphs. It's the language of repeated follow-up messages. It's the language of trying to force clarity from someone who isn't currently offering it. You know what I'm talking about. The text that begins with, "Can we talk?" The message that says, "I don't understand what's happening." The paragraph explaining how hurt, confused, or frustrated you feel. Now, let me be clear. There is nothing wrong with expressing your emotions. There is nothing wrong with wanting communication. There is nothing wrong with desiring clarity. But timing matters, energy matters, and most importantly, the emotional state from which you're communicating matters. Because when someone is already creating distance, pressure rarely brings them closer. In fact, pressure often pushes them further away. Think about it for a moment. If someone is feeling overwhelmed, uncertain, emotionally unavailable, or simply needing space, and they suddenly receive a message demanding answers, demanding certainty, demanding reassurance, what happens? They feel even more pressure, and pressure creates resistance. This is why so many people send messages that are technically reasonable but emotionally ineffective. The words themselves aren't the problem. The energy behind them is. People can feel when a message is carrying anxiety. They can feel when a message is really saying, "Please make me feel okay." They can feel when a message is carrying the weight of your expectations, and that weight can be heavy. That's why one of the most powerful things you can do is send a message that creates freedom instead of pressure. A message that says, "I understand if you need some space. No pressure. Wishing you a great week." Now, some people hear that and immediately think, that's too simple. Exactly, because confidence is often simple. Insecurity complicates everything. Confidence doesn't need 10 paragraphs. Confidence doesn't need a dramatic speech. Confidence doesn't need to convince. Confidence simply communicates and then lets go. What makes a message like that powerful isn't the wording itself. It's what the wording communicates. It communicates emotional security. It communicates self-respect. It communicates trust. Most importantly, it communicates that you are not trying to control the outcome. And that's rare, because so many people are obsessed with controlling outcomes. They're trying to control how quickly someone responds. They're trying to control how someone feels. They're trying to control whether someone stays. They're trying to control the future of the relationship. But relationships don't thrive under control. They thrive under choice. The strongest connections are built when two people freely choose each other, not when one person pressures the other into staying. And when you send a message that removes pressure, you're giving someone room to make that choice. Now, here's where many people get confused. They think that creating freedom means becoming passive. It doesn't. They think it means lowering standards. It doesn't. They think it means accepting poor treatment. Absolutely not. Creating freedom is not about having no boundaries. It's about respecting both your boundaries and theirs. It's about saying, I'm available for a healthy connection, but I'm not going to force one. That distinction changes everything, because forcing connection never creates genuine intimacy. It only creates temporary compliance. Someone might respond because they feel guilty. Someone might reply because they feel obligated. Someone might stay because they don't want conflict. But none of those things create authentic attraction. What creates authentic attraction is emotional safety. And emotional safety comes from knowing that someone isn't trying to control you. Think about the people you feel most comfortable around. They're usually not the people constantly demanding something from you. They're the people who allow you to be yourself. They're the people who don't make every interaction feel like a test. They're the people who trust. And trust is magnetic. Now, does this mean every avoidant person will suddenly come running back because you sent one calm message? Of course not. No text message has that kind of power. And that's actually an important realization. Because when people search for the perfect text, they're often searching for a way to control another person's behavior. But the goal isn't control. The goal is self-respect. The goal is showing up in a way that aligns with the person you want to become. A person who can communicate openly without chasing, a person who can express care without losing dignity, a person who can give someone freedom without abandoning themselves. That's real strength. And here's something fascinating. The moment you stop trying to force a response is often the moment your energy changes completely. You stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. You stop analyzing every word. You stop treating their reply as a measure of your worth. You begin reclaiming your emotional independence. And that's powerful because emotional independence creates emotional attractiveness. People are drawn to those who have peace within themselves, not because they're perfect, not because they're detached, but because they carry a sense of stability, a sense that says, I'd love this connection to work, but my happiness doesn't depend on it. That energy is incredibly compelling because it comes from abundance rather than scarcity. It comes from confidence rather than fear. It comes from trust rather than control. So the next time you're tempted to send the emotional novel, the next time you're tempted to chase an answer, the next time you're tempted to force certainty where uncertainty exists, remember this. The most powerful message is often the one that gives someone the freedom to choose while reminding yourself that your value was never dependent on their response. Now, after you've stopped chasing and you've learned how to communicate without pressure, there's another lesson that many people find even harder to accept. You have to learn to let silence work for you. And I know that's difficult because silence feels uncomfortable. Silence feels uncertain. Silence feels like something is wrong. For many people, silence immediately triggers fear. The moment a text goes unanswered, their mind starts creating stories. They assume interest is fading. They assume they've done something wrong. They assume the relationship is slipping away. And because that uncertainty feels unbearable, they rush to fill the gap. Another message, another check-in, another attempt to restart the conversation. Anything to avoid sitting with the discomfort of not knowing. But here's what most people never realize. The silence itself is rarely the problem. The problem is what we make the silence mean. When someone doesn't respond right away, we often treat that moment as evidence of rejection. We treat it as proof that we're losing them. We treat it as confirmation of our deepest fears. But silence doesn't automatically mean rejection. Sometimes it means someone is busy. Sometimes it means they're processing their emotions. Sometimes it means they need space. And sometimes it simply means life is happening. The challenge is that when we panic in response to silence, we often create the very outcome we're trying to avoid. Because panic leads to pressure, and pressure creates distance. Think about how many relationships have been damaged, not by silence itself, but by someone's reaction to silence. The anxious follow-up, the emotional confrontation, the constant checking, the desperate need for reassurance. All of it driven by a fear that silence means something terrible. But what if silence wasn't your enemy? What if silence was actually serving a purpose? You see, attraction doesn't just grow through presence. Attraction also grows through absence. People need space to experience your value. People need room to think about you. People need the opportunity to miss you. And that opportunity disappears when you're constantly available. Now, I'm not talking about playing games. I'm not talking about intentionally ignoring people. I'm not talking about pretending to be busy when you're not. That's manipulation. And manipulation never creates healthy relationships. What I'm talking about is something completely different. I'm talking about allowing natural space to exist without rushing to eliminate it. Because when you constantly fill every moment with communication, you're removing an important part of human connection. Anticipation, reflection, curiosity. Imagine listening to your favorite song. If every second of the song was played at maximum volume with no pauses, no rhythm, no variation, it would become exhausting. The pauses matter, the spaces matter. The silence between notes gives the music its meaning. Relationships are no different. Connection needs room to breathe. And when you refuse to allow that space, you can unintentionally suffocate the very thing you're trying to protect. One of the most powerful realizations you can have is that your absence has value too. Most people focus entirely on what they provide when they're present, their attention, their affection, their support, their communication, but they never consider what happens when they're gone. They never allow someone the chance to feel their absence. And here's the irony. Someone cannot miss you if you're always there. Someone cannot appreciate your energy if they never experience life without it. Someone cannot fully recognize your value if they have unlimited access to it, regardless of how they behave. Again, this isn't about punishment. It's not about withholding. It's not about trying to make someone suffer. It's about understanding a basic truth of human psychology. We often gain clarity when we have space. We often recognize value when we have distance. We often understand what matters when we're given time to reflect. That's why silence can be so powerful. Not because silence manipulates people, but because silence allows reality to speak. If someone genuinely cares about you, silence gives them room to feel that. If someone is curious about you, silence gives that curiosity room to grow. If someone values your presence, silence helps them recognize it. And if someone doesn't care, silence reveals that too. Either way, silence provides information. It reveals truth. And truth is always better than chasing an illusion. Now, here's the deeper reason silence is so important. Silence isn't just about what happens in the other person's mind. It's about what happens in yours. Because when communication stops, you are forced to confront yourself. You are forced to sit with your fears. You are forced to examine your attachment to outcomes. You are forced to ask difficult questions. Why am I so uncomfortable right now? Why do I need immediate reassurance? Why am I allowing someone else's response time to determine my emotional state? Those questions can be uncomfortable, but they can also be transformational, because every moment you resist the urge to chase, you're building emotional strength. Every moment you choose patience over panic, you're building confidence. Every moment you allow uncertainty without trying to control it, you're becoming more secure. And that security changes everything. You begin to realize that silence cannot destroy your value. You begin to realize that uncertainty cannot diminish your worth. You begin to realize that your peace does not have to depend on constant validation. That's when silence stops feeling like a threat. It starts feeling like freedom. Freedom from overthinking, freedom from chasing, freedom from trying to control things that were never yours to control in the first place. And when you reach that place, something remarkable happens. You stop fearing silence because you finally understand that the strongest connections don't need constant maintenance to survive every quiet moment. They have enough trust to let space exist. They have enough confidence to let life happen. And they have enough security to know that not every silence needs to be filled. Sometimes the strongest message you can send is no message at all. Now, once you've learned how to stop chasing, communicate without pressure, and become comfortable with silence, there's another shift that changes everything. You have to build a life that doesn't revolve around them. And I know this sounds obvious. Most people hear that and immediately think, of course my life doesn't revolve around them. But if we're honest, sometimes it does. Not physically, not intentionally, but emotionally. You wake up thinking about them. You check your phone hoping to hear from them. You replay conversations in your mind. You analyze every interaction. You wonder what they're doing. You wonder what they're thinking. You wonder when they'll reach out. And before you realize it, they have become the center of your emotional world. Your day feels better when they text. Your day feels worse when they don't. Your confidence rises when they show interest. Your confidence falls when they pull away. Without meaning to, you've handed them control over your emotional state. And that's exactly why this next lesson is so important, because attraction thrives when two people have full lives that come together. It struggles when one person's life starts revolving around the other. Think about the people you admire most. The people who naturally attract others, the people who seem confident, grounded, and magnetic. What do they have in common? They have a life. They have goals. They have passions. They have friendships. They have purpose. They wake up every day with things that matter to them beyond any single relationship. And that creates a powerful energy, because when someone has a meaningful life, they don't approach relationships from a place of desperation. They approach them from a place of abundance. They're not looking for someone to become their entire world. They're looking for someone to add to an already fulfilling world. That's a completely different mindset, and people can feel the difference immediately. You see, one of the reasons avoidant people often pull away is because they sense pressure. Not always direct pressure. Sometimes it's emotional pressure. The feeling that someone needs them to provide happiness. The feeling that someone is relying on them for fulfillment. The feeling that someone has made them responsible for their emotional well-being. And that's a heavy burden for anyone to carry. No relationship can thrive when one person becomes the sole source of another person's joy. That's why it's so important to keep building your own life. Not as a strategy, not as a tactic, not to make someone jealous, but because it's genuinely good for you. Because the strongest version of yourself is not sitting around waiting for a text message. The strongest version of yourself is actively creating a life you're excited to wake up to. I want you to imagine two different scenarios. In the first scenario, someone is waiting all day for a message. Their attention keeps returning to their phone. Their mood changes every time they see a notification. Their entire day feels like it's on hold until they hear from one specific person. Now imagine another person. They wake up with goals. They have projects they're passionate about. They spend time with people they care about. They exercise. They learn. They grow. They pursue experiences that challenge and inspire them. Of course, they care about the relationship. Of course, they enjoy hearing from the person they like. But their life keeps moving forward regardless. Which person do you think feels more attractive? Which person do you think feels more confident? Which person do you think has a stronger sense of self? The answer is obvious. Because confidence isn't something you think your way into. Confidence is something you build through action. Every goal you pursue strengthens it. Every challenge you overcome strengthens it. Every promise you keep to yourself strengthens it. And here's what starts happening when you become deeply engaged in your own life. You stop obsessing. You stop overanalyzing. You stop making every interaction mean more than it actually does. It's because your world becomes bigger. Your identity becomes richer. Your happiness becomes more diversified. And that's incredibly important. Because when all of your emotional investment is concentrated in one person, every little fluctuation feels enormous. A delayed response feels devastating. A cancelled plan feels catastrophic. A moment of distance feels terrifying. But when your life is full, those same events lose their power over you. You still care. You're still invested, but you're no longer dependent. And dependency is often what creates anxiety. When your happiness depends entirely on one outcome, fear becomes inevitable. But when your happiness comes from many different sources, you become resilient. You become emotionally free. And that freedom changes the way people experience you, because people are naturally drawn to those who are engaged with life. They're drawn to passion. They're drawn to purpose. They're drawn to enthusiasm. They're drawn to people who are creating something meaningful, not because those things are impressive, but because they reveal someone who is alive, someone who is growing, someone who is becoming. And growth is attractive. There's something magnetic about a person who is moving forward, a person who is investing in themselves, a person who refuses to put their entire life on hold while waiting for another person to decide how they feel. That kind of energy stands out. And perhaps most importantly, it protects you. Because whether the relationship works out or not, you're still building a better life. You're still becoming stronger. You're still developing confidence. You're still creating experiences that matter. You're still growing into the person you're capable of becoming. That means you win regardless of the outcome. And that's a powerful place to live from, because the goal was never to make someone the center of your world. The goal was always to become the center of your own. Build a life so meaningful that no relationship becomes your entire identity, and you'll never have to chase someone to feel complete. Now, after you've stopped chasing, learn to communicate without pressure, become comfortable with silence, and built a life that doesn't revolve around another person, you arrive at one of the most important lessons of all. You must value yourself enough to walk away. And I know that statement can feel uncomfortable, because most people don't want to walk away. Most people want the relationship to work. They want the connection to deepen. They want the person they care about to finally show up, finally commit, finally reciprocate. That's understandable. When you care about about someone, your instinct is often to hold on, to keep trying, to stay hopeful, to give one more chance, and then another, and another, until one day you realize you've been fighting for something that the other person hasn't been fighting for at all. This is where so many people lose themselves, not because they love too much, but because they stayed too long in situations that required them to abandon their self-respect. I want you to understand something. Loving someone is not the same thing as tolerating everything. Caring about someone is not the same thing as accepting whatever treatment they choose to give you. And commitment is not measured by how much poor behavior you're willing to endure. Yet people confuse these things all the time. They think loyalty means staying no matter what. They think patience means accepting endless inconsistency. They think understanding means making excuses for behavior that continually hurts them. And little by little, their standards begin to disappear. They start accepting breadcrumbs because they're afraid of losing the possibility of a feast. They start celebrating the bare minimum because they've forgotten what genuine effort looks like. They start convincing themselves that things will change someday if they just wait a little longer. But here's the difficult truth. Potential is not reality. Who someone could become is not who they are today. And one of the most painful mistakes people make is falling in love with potential while ignoring reality. They keep investing in a future version of someone who may never arrive. Meanwhile, the actual relationship continues to leave them feeling anxious, confused, and emotionally exhausted. At some point, you have to stop asking what someone might become and start paying attention to who they consistently show themselves to be. Because patterns matter, consistency matters, actions matter. Anyone can say the right thing, anyone can make promises, anyone can offer explanations. But relationships are built on behavior, not intentions, behavior. If someone repeatedly disappears, that matters. If someone repeatedly avoids accountability, that matters. If someone repeatedly gives you reasons to doubt their investment, that matters. And no amount of hope should blind you to those realities. Now, let me be clear. Walking away doesn't mean giving up at the first sign of difficulty. Every relationship encounters challenges. Every person has flaws. Every connection requires patience, communication, and understanding. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about situations where one person is carrying the entire relationship on their shoulders. We're talking about situations where your needs are consistently dismissed. We're talking about situations where your self-worth is slowly being traded away in exchange for tiny moments of validation. And when that starts happening, something has to change. Because the longer you remain in situations that don't honor your value, the more you begin questioning your value. You start wondering whether your standards are too high. You start wondering whether you're asking for too much. You start wondering whether basic consistency, effort, and respect are somehow unreasonable expectations. They're not. Healthy relationships don't require you to shrink yourself in order to keep someone comfortable. Healthy relationships don't require you to constantly earn what should be freely given. Healthy relationships don't require you to sacrifice your dignity for connection. And that's why the willingness to walk away is so powerful. Not because walking away forces someone to chase you. Not because it creates scarcity. Not because it's some clever strategy. It's powerful because it reminds you that your value is not dependent on anyone else's decision. Think about that. The moment you're willing to walk away from something unhealthy, you're making a declaration. You're saying, I would rather be alone than betray myself. That's strength. That's confidence. That's self-respect. And ironically, that's the quality many people are searching for when they ask how to become more attractive. They think attraction comes from saying the perfect thing. They think attraction comes from looking a certain way. They think attraction comes from understanding psychological tricks. But one of the most attractive qualities in the world is someone who genuinely values themselves, someone who knows their worth, someone who has standards, someone who refuses to stay where they are consistently undervalued, because that person communicates something powerful. They communicate that their presence is valuable, that their time is valuable, that their energy is valuable. And people tend to value what is valued. Now, here's the beautiful part. When you're truly willing to walk away, something inside you changes. You stop negotiating with your own standards. You stop begging for what should be mutual. You stop living in constant fear of loss because you've already accepted a truth that many people spend years avoiding. The truth that losing the wrong person is not a tragedy. Losing yourself is. And once you understand that, you become free. Free from chasing, free from settling, free from the exhausting cycle of trying to convince someone to give you what they were never willing to give. Because you finally realize that the greatest act of self-love is not holding on at all costs. It's having the courage to leave when staying costs you your self-respect. The moment you value yourself enough to walk away is the moment you stop fearing loss and start protecting what matters most, your own worth. Now, after everything we've talked about, stopping the chase, communicating without pressure, becoming comfortable with silence, building a life that doesn't revolve around another person, and valuing yourself enough to walk away, we arrive at the final shift. And this one changes the entire game. Because at this point, the goal is no longer to make someone chase you. The goal is to become the person they fear losing. Now be careful with that idea. When people hear those words, they often misunderstand them. They think it's about creating jealousy. They think it's about becoming unavailable. They think it's about manipulating someone's emotions. That's not what I mean. What I mean is becoming so grounded, so fulfilled, so connected to your own worth that your presence becomes genuinely valuable. Not because you've convinced people you're valuable, because you actually are. You see, many people spend years trying to make themselves irresistible to one specific person. They study every text message. They analyze every interaction. They search for the perfect strategy, the perfect response, the perfect technique, all in hopes that one day someone will finally realize how amazing they are. But here's the irony. The people who are most attractive are rarely focused on becoming attractive. They're focused on becoming, they're focused on growing, they're focused on living, they're focused on creating a life they love. And that process naturally creates attraction because confidence is attractive. Purpose is attractive, passion is attractive, self-respect is attractive, emotional stability is attractive. Not because these qualities impress people, but because they create trust. When someone encounters a person who genuinely values themselves, they feel it. There's a calmness there, a certainty, a grounded energy that doesn't desperately seek approval. And that's powerful. Think about the people you've met who leave a lasting impression. Very often, it's not because they were the loudest. It's not because they demanded attention. It's not because they were constantly trying to prove themselves. It's because they carried themselves with a quiet confidence. A confidence that said, I know who I am. That kind of confidence can't be faked. It comes from doing the inner work. It comes from keeping promises to yourself. It comes from building a life you're proud of. It comes from surviving disappointments and realizing you're still okay. It comes from discovering that your worth was never dependent on another person's validation. And once you understand that, something remarkable happens. You stop approaching relationships from a position of fear. Fear of losing them, fear of being rejected, fear of not being enough, fear of abandonment. Those fears no longer control your actions because you've built something stronger than fear. You've built self-trust. You trust yourself to handle whatever happens. You trust yourself to survive disappointment. You trust yourself to move forward even if things don't work out. And when you trust yourself, you stop clinging, you stop grasping, you stop trying to force outcomes. That's when people experience you differently because nothing feels more attractive than someone who wants connection but doesn't need it to survive. There's a huge difference between desire and dependency. Desire says, I would love to have you in my life. Dependency says, I need you in my life to feel okay. One creates attraction, the other creates pressure, and people can feel that difference immediately. Now, here's something many people never consider. The reason some people become unforgettable isn't because they're perfect. It's because they have standards, not standards for others alone, standards for themselves. They have standards for how they spend their time, standards for how they treat people, standards for how they show up in relationships, standards for the life they're creating. And because they have those standards, they become rare. They become someone whose presence carries weight because they're not available to every situation. They're not willing to tolerate every behavior. They're not willing to sacrifice their values for temporary attention. That's what makes someone difficult to lose. Not because they're playing hard to get, but because they genuinely bring something meaningful into the lives of the people around them. Think about this for a moment. If someone can constantly ignore you, disappoint you, take you for granted, and you're still always there, there, what motivation do they have to appreciate your presence? Very little, because your presence has become predictable, guaranteed, expected. But when someone knows that you value yourself enough to leave unhealthy situations, your presence becomes meaningful. Not because you're threatening to leave, but because they understand that staying in your life requires mutual respect. And that's a healthy dynamic. The goal is never to make someone afraid of losing you through manipulation. The goal is to become someone whose absence would genuinely be felt. Someone who brings positivity, someone who brings strength, someone who brings authenticity, someone who brings emotional maturity, someone who brings peace rather than chaos. Those qualities are priceless. And the beautiful thing is that they benefit you whether someone chases you or not. Because this entire journey was never really about another person. It was about you. It was about becoming someone who no longer abandons themselves for love, someone who no longer sacrifices their dignity for attention, someone who no longer measures their worth through another person's behavior. When you become that person, relationships stop feeling like a battlefield. They stop feeling like a constant struggle for validation. They stop feeling like a test you have to pass. Instead, they become what they were always meant to be. A connection between two whole people who choose each other freely. And that's the moment everything changes. Because the people who are hardest to lose are not the people who chase, beg, convince, or cling. They're the people who know their value, live with purpose, and refuse to forget who they are for the sake of anyone else's approval. Become someone who is so connected to their own worth that losing you would be a consequence of someone else's choice, not a reflection of your value.